Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. And on this series, Theory Crafting, I take civilizations and units not yet present in AoE2 and take my best stab at designing a sensible and historically accurate framework for them as they might appear in-game. On this particular episode, we're going to be looking at a Mesoamerican civilization that I have received countless comments for. They are famously the only Mesoamerican people to not be conquered by the Aztecs at their height. You might know them as the Tarascans, but today we will be talking about the Purépecha. As mentioned, the Purépecha are often referred to as the Tarascans in historical sources. This was the name the Spanish had for them, and it is a term laden with a lot of cultural baggage, so I'm going to be using just the term Purépecha for today's presentation. I'll give you a little bit on the history of the term Tarascan a little bit later on in the history section. As always, if you want to see any disclaimers about this build and this process of mine, or if you want to learn about my philosophy, how I approach these designs, take a look at the screen now. And as always, remember that there is a comprehensive civilization document with all of the details for everything about this build and all of my sources linked down in the description below. With that all being said, let's move on to Purépecha history. So when we are talking about the Purépecha, we are primarily going to be focusing on about a 450 odd span of time, but just know that they were a prominent fixture within what is now Mexico well before then. There is evidence of Purépecha tribal influence as far back as like 1000 BC, and they, along with a great many other Mesoamerican tribal peoples, settled in what is now the Mexican state of Michoacan. However, the Purépecha began to ascend beyond their rivals, starting in the relatively early AD times, becoming preeminent within the area by about 350 AD. Obviously, we have very few Mesoamerican civilizations, so I'm just kind of using the ones we have to represent these other tribal peoples. So why Michoacan? Well, it turns out that way back in the day, Michoacan was probably the single most fertile part of all of Mexico, specifically the area between the three Great Lakes of the state, Zacapu, Quetzeo, and Pátzcuaro. These three lakes, along with the mineral-rich soil, lush forests, and ore-filled mountains of the area, made this a region of absolute abundance, and the fledgling Purépecha peoples quickly capitalized upon this abundance to rapidly advance in power over the next several hundred years, right up until their first true golden age in 1350 AD. There is a lot of evidence that the Purépecha had an established state before then, probably around 1100 AD, but 1350 is when we know that they established their second capital, and with it started to gain a massive dominance within the region in terms of their population and territory. The Purépecha's first capital had been founded about 25 years before this, but it was quickly moved to the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro and was called Tzintzuntzan, which roughly translates to Place of the Hummingbirds. This is still a relatively famous archaeological site in Mexico today, and was centered around a massive temple and tomb complex that likely housed the nobility of the Purépecha, as well as being one of their primary religious centers. In terms of their faith, they practiced a very similar set of beliefs to all other Mesoamerican peoples in the Mexico region, but with their own local flavor. So the Purépecha were doing very, very well at this time, and started to conquer a pretty substantial area. But a new force would soon rise to rival them, those being the mighty Aztec Empire. The Mexica settled at Tenochtitlan and soon started to cast their own imperial net, including reaching into Purépecha lands. This was in the early mid-1400s AD. So the Purépecha and the Aztecs fought a series of vicious campaigns against each other, battles involving tens of thousands of dead, with both sides raising many levies from their many tributary tribes. But the Purépecha remained unconquered, even demanding victory concessions from the Aztecs and planting big border forts exactly between their realm to make sure that the Aztecs had a lot harder time driving in future. All this means that by about the late 1400s AD, the Purépecha were in a dominant position, not stronger than the Aztecs, but certainly not able to be displaced by them. At one point, the Purépecha had even driven the Aztecs back to within like 50 miles of their capital, and that's a big frickin' deal considering how big of a territory the Aztecs had and how protected their capital was in almost all other campaigns they embarked upon. But all of these victories was soon to become largely invalidated when the Spanish came a-knockin' in the early 1500s AD. Once the Aztecs realized just what a threat the Spanish were, and as the Spanish were starting to kind of rally the Aztecs' many enemies around them, the Aztecs sent a plea to their neighbors and former rivals, the mighty Purépecha, saying, Please help us, this guy is going to destroy everything. And the Purépecha said, no. But this refusal wasn't just out of spite towards the Aztecs. The Purépecha had been closely observing the Spanish invasion and had made the calculated guess that they would win, and as such it would be better to be on good terms with victors rather than picking the losing dog in the fight. And as such, when the Spanish later came to the Three Great Lakes to consult with the Purépecha, they actually yielded themselves willingly. Their king at the time even converted to Christianity. And this meant that the Purépecha were largely spared from the many great wars of expansion and religious conversion that were to follow the Spanish conquest. That doesn't mean that they got off easy though, because once Spain started to establish itself within Mexico, corruption and crimes against humanity ran rampant. The many officials who Cortés effectively bribed into helping him out with promises of money and wealth just kind of took the opportunity to take whatever they wanted, including land, gold, slaves, and even women. And this is where the term Tarascan came from. The Spanish picked up this word from the Purépecha tarasque, which roughly translates to brother-in-law, which they used scathingly and pejoratively in reference to the Spanish because of how often Spanish officers took their women away from them. What's worse, all of these atrocities only multiplied when one of the single most evil men in history came to power in the region, this being Governor Guzman. He was appointed by the Spanish crown once Cortés was retired, and he just pretty much took the opportunity to play king and take literally whatever he wanted. Just multiply all of the bad stuff that was happening under Cortés by 10, and you get Guzman. Franciscan friars in the region watched in horror what Guzman was doing and quickly reported his misdeeds to the Spanish crown. They said, oh no, that's very bad, that's our new colony, and tried to arrest him. He fled to Purépecha lands, killed their king, announced himself as king, took all their gold, and fled, but he was captured and brought to justice back in Spain. Now, Spain knew that they had an uphill battle in repairing their relations with the Purépecha, who were completely scarred by the whole Guzman experience. The Purépecha were some of Spain's closest allies in the region, or at least some of the most cooperative Mesoamerican peoples in the region before Guzman came to power. And as such, they actually embarked on a major reparative campaign to try to rebuild Purépecha trust, returning to them land, autonomy, as well as many, many gifts to try to show that they really didn't mean it and he was an exception rather than the norm. Whether that was true is another debate entirely, but where this led to was that the Purépecha did soon kind of regain their trust in Spain as their rulers, and arguably ended up being the best off of all of the vassal Mesoamerican peoples in New Spain, what we now know as Mexico. In fact, one of the descendants of the Purépecha kingly line ended up being the governor of New Spain itself, directly reporting to the Spanish crown. And so, in all, while the Purépecha were forced to endure some horrific stuff during the Spanish occupation, theirs was not nearly the same story of conquest and bloodshed that you see with people like the Aztecs. So where are they now? The Purépecha are still alive and kicking within primarily Michoacan in what is now Mexico. They are a very vocal and prominent culture within Mexico. I would say that the Purépecha people now are doing quite well overall. Okay, now with history done, let's move on to some of the flavor for this particular civilization. First of all, the architecture. It's American. What a surprise. With unique skins for the dock and the castle. While the Purépecha are not a true naval civilization, there is a substantial reason for them having unique dock skins, which I will get to a little bit later. Their language would be Purépecha, Nari Jarhaski, ladies and gentlemen. It is a language still spoken today, by the way, and I believe is relatively unbroken from how it sounded way back in the AoE2 relevant time frame, so it would be relatively easy to research this one. Their wonder would be the great Yakatas of Tsinsun-san. These are some of the beautiful temple tomb housing complexes that made up the centerpiece of the Purépecha's great second capital. Not only do they look beautiful now, but obviously you would model them after how they might have looked at their height. So a riot of color with spectacular sculptures all around them, gilded with gold. They look fantastic. Moving on to some campaigns for the Purépecha. While Mesoamerican campaign protagonists are often difficult to research, I didn't have much trouble with this one. The first of our options would be the great chieftain king Tariakuri. He led the Wakusecha clan, who were de facto leaders of the Purépecha through much of their history, who founded their first capital on the far shores of Lake Pátzcuaro in about 1325. It is argued that he is the first one among all of the Purépecha leadership to actually unite their clans into something resembling an empire, and after founding this first capital, he did make several great expansion bids, even claiming some of the first Nahua lands that the Purépecha would come into possession of. So Tariakuri was the man who started it all. Obviously, you need other Mesoamerican civilizations implemented in the game to give it proper diversity, but I still think that he is a fine pick for a protagonist, though I will say, there is one better. Tsitsipantaquare. He was arguably the greatest ruler that the Purépecha people ever had. He ruled 150 years after Tariakuri, and among his many claims to fame is he, first of all, completely reformed the Purépecha government into a well-oiled bureaucratic machine. He turned what was effectively a loosely tied coalition into a true imperial power, and a Tsitsipantaquare campaign would absolutely focus on his many battles against the Aztecs, led specifically by the Aztec lord Tlatoani Ashiacatl. These many battles and skirmishes culminated in the famous Battle of Tashimaroa, where a desperate Aztec force rushed a Purépecha encampment while outnumbered and were absolutely devastated, putting a permanent end to Aztec ambitions in the region and allowing Tsitsipantaquare to set up the many famous border forts that marked the delineation line between Aztec and Purépecha lands. So overall, some great, huge, bloody battles, a decent amount of civilization diversity once we get some more Mesoamerican civilizations added to the game, and a really interesting guy who certainly has left his mark upon history as the greatest of all the Purépecha rulers. Moving on from there, what other current campaigns could my Purépecha civilization star in? Montezuma? Maybe? Especially Montezuma 1. I heard that they specifically designed that scenario to kind of showcase all of the new Mesoamerican civilizations, so you could put them there. Besides that, not really any other options, unfortunately. But there are a couple other campaign ideas I wanted to share with you before we move on. The first one being Tangashoan II. He was the Purépecha king in charge when the Spaniards came, and was the one who had the idea to kind of negotiate with the Spaniards and willingly go along with their conquest of the realm. He converted to Christianity and actually maintained very good relations with the Spanish, even allowing his people to be spared much of the devastation that Spanish corruption wrought on the rest of Mesoamerica, though still they suffered many atrocities all the same. Of course, this campaign would end with him being killed by the wicked Governor Guzman, and I think it could be interesting for the last scenario of this campaign to show Guzman being brought to justice even after Tangashoan was dead. He's an interesting character who had clearly a keen mind for diplomacy. There is, however, one last unusual Purépecha campaign protagonist I wanted to highlight, that being a Spanish fellow, Don Vasco de Quiroga. Now, after Guzman had absolutely obliterated all trust the Purépecha had for the Spanish crown actually appointed this man, Don Vasco de Quiroga, who was a judge in Spain at the time and a very devoutly religious man, to go out and single-handedly helm the reparation efforts within the region. And he did this, by all accounts, with 100% good nature and good intent. He went out, he learned the language, he learned the culture, he gave gifts, he organized these kind of like public dances to kind of tempt the Purépecha from their hiding places and show that there was goodwill again. And most importantly, from, again, all accounts that I could see, obviously there might be biased sources involved, but this is what I saw in my research, he was absolutely beloved by the Purépecha people as a Spaniard who truly cared about them and truly wanted to see them do well. It was under him that Purépecha children started to gain education in these admittedly very religious schools, but still they did learn usable skills in addition to religion, and they started to redevelop their economy to the point where after Don Vasco was recalled, or Tata Vasco, because they actually called him Dad, that was his name among the Purépecha. After he was recalled though, the Purépecha were left with the best indigenous economy in Mexico. They were doing very, very well, and a big part of it is that he kind of helped rebuild their morale while also procuring the funds to rebuild their infrastructure. So he would be like a pacifist campaign, maybe even a single big sprawling scenario where you're not doing so much fighting, maybe a little bit, but mostly you're trying to restore goodwill, probably with a bunch of RPG style quests and maybe some diplomacy stuff, maybe some hide and seek, maybe some logic and social puzzles. It could be a fun one, and it's a nice kind of feels good, wholesome campaign. So I wanted to mention it, even if I think a native Purépecha ruler like Titipan de Cuare would be a much better fit for a campaign proper. With that, let's move on to some major themes. Through lines through Purépecha history that I focus substantially on when designing my civilization build for them. The first being prosperity. The area they settled within Michoacan was, as mentioned, one of the most bountiful regions in all of Mexico. They had the great soil, they had wood, they had ore, they also had tons and tons of fish, to the point where the Aztecs actually referred to Michoacan as the place of the fish masters. This is also the reason I wanted the Purépecha to have a unique skin for the dock, since fishing was a major part of their economy almost as much as farming was. The other one being that the Purépecha, much like the Zapotecs who came before them, had an absolute stranglehold on trade within their region. Not only did they vassalize many other clans and tribal peoples and demand trade and tribute from them, but they also traded with many of the other great powers of the region. What did they want? They wanted luxuries for the most part. They had a great love of turquoise and feathers and dyes and obsidian, and all of this led to a great amount of control over the region. Not only did the Purépecha have a very sophisticated government, but their prosperity was so great that they were actually able to focus on gathering luxury resources that they wanted rather than staples that they needed to survive. And they were more than happy to conquer in search of these luxury resources. And because of this kind of strong-arm trade strategy, they ended up being some of the most opulent of all the Mesoamerican peoples. This hegemony also exercised itself via those forts that they built on their borders to make sure people knew where Purépecha territory began. And rebellions within the realm were almost unheard of, primarily because they were also quite well known for building fortresses and other guard posts within areas that they conquered to make sure people couldn't get up to any ship. So you may be thinking, alright, well the Purépecha were collecting all this trade, they were conquering all these people, but what made people so scared of them? Why didn't people just fight back? Well, the Purépecha had some of the most interesting military innovations that Mesoamerica ever saw. The first being their widespread use of copper in weapons and armor. They were famed metalsmiths. Obviously, metalsmithing was very common in Mesoamerica for softer metals like silver and gold, but the Purépecha were able to use copper and refine it to the point where it could actually be usable in war, even making bronze at certain points. The Aztecs too used copper for their tools, but primarily they bought it from the Purépecha. So in addition to selling this copper, they made very good use of it themselves. They were also well known for being tricksters in war, ambushing and outwitting their enemies. There was one story I really enjoyed where the Purépecha left out a big train of provisions in a path that they knew an Aztec army was marching. The Aztecs got there, were exhausted, and were like, oh, great, provisions. Let's steal these and have lunch. And as they were sitting down to eat, the Purépecha jumped out of nowhere, surrounded them, and killed a force like 3 times the size. And so it was this tactical genius coupled with their technological superiority. Their spearheads were famed for being able to punch right through shields that would normally protect against other Mesoamerican weapons, that the Purépecha were able to enforce the hegemony that they so effectively claimed over Western Mexico. And with all that, we come to the end of the history section of this Purépecha build. If this was all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe before you tap out. For all of those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what I've done with the Purépecha in-game, let's move on to game mechanics. Beginning with some necessary updates. As I mentioned in my Zapotecs video, I'm proposing a massive overhaul of all Mesoamerican civilizations to give them 3 new regional units. The first being taking the Aztec Jaguar warrior and making it a regional barracks unit available in the Castle Age. it would be the Mesoamerican equivalent of a knight, assuming the Eagle Warrior was kind of a hussar equivalent. It would obviously be weaker than a knight overall, but would train faster, be a bit cheaper, and have an attack bonus versus units below 33% HP. This is me trying to represent how Jaguar warriors were often going after slaves, like taking those who were already weak and either executing them on the spot or capturing them for use in sacrifices later on. So they were opportunistic. And as mentioned, they are cheaper than knights and are even affected by supplies to become cheaper still. They would also benefit from the new Gambeson's technology. That being said, the Jaguar Warrior must be installed. It is a barracks unit, so you don't need to build a stable for it, of course. But before you can train any, you must research this technology. It's relatively cheap, and it's not too long, but it will mean that you have to overcome a small speed bump before you can start spamming these guys out in Castle Age. Now, I should note the Purépecha do not have access to the elite Jaguar Warrior, though the Zapotecs do, so they won't really be able to rely on anything past the base Jag in Castle Age, and instead have to default to other strategies later in the game. Now, second of these Mesoamerican regional units is the Slinger, stolen, of course, from the Incas. This is a trash unit, similar to the Hussar only insofar as it's quite good against other trash and only costs food, but other than that, completely incomparable. It's very much like a skirmisher, but while it does a bit better with damage and speed, it obviously has no specialization against enemy ranged attacks and has worse accuracy. It also has a small attack bonus versus infantry, very small, but the main selling point of the Slinger is it can never do less than 2 damage with an attack, no matter the opponent's pierce armor. 3 for elite. This means that if you get a big death ball of them, they're actually very good at overwhelming strong enemy units late game, kind of like how Hussars do a lot more damage than other trash units could normally be expected to do. They cost 60 food, so cheaper than a Hussar, but they have much, much worse staying power, meaning that you cannot rely on them as a frontline screen for your other troops. Last of the regional units is the Atlatl. This is kind of a cavalry archer equivalent, kinda, but it really serves a very different role altogether. This is an archery range unit. It's a lot weaker than a cavalry archer, but it has better range and accuracy, making it serve kind of more like an arbalester replacement that has a lot more mobility. It also has a small attack bonus versus cavalry, and its projectiles actually do a little bit of damage to units behind the main target, much like a Gulam, though not very much. So in summary, this is a great unit for countering clusters of enemy cavalry late game, as well as doing some hit and run raiding stuff and supporting your troops from afar as a primary backline range power unit. It costs 60 wood, 40 gold. Like the Jaguar Warrior, it must also be installed at the archery range before you can build it. Now, of course, you couldn't just stick all of these units into the game right now without it causing all sorts of problems. There would be many, many compensations made within the existing Mesoamerican civilization tech trees to compensate for them getting these new units, as well as things like the Aztec unique unit, Aztec and Mayan Castle Age unique technology, the Incan Slinger need to change. There's many things that would need to change to accommodate these. I mentioned some potential solutions in my Zapotec's video, specifically making the Aztec unique unit the Shorn one, an infantry unit, very powerful, very slow moving, and has a lifesteal effect of some kind when it strikes. And the Incan unique unit at the archery range being changed to a bola thrower called a Liwi, who would be able to actually pin enemies in place briefly. But suffice to say for now that I'll be going into more detail about all of these changes at some point in the future when I actually take a more significant look at Mesoamerican civilizations as a whole. Let's move on to an overview of the Purépecha proper, now that we have an idea of the regional units that would be in the background of this civilization's design. Purépecha, an economy and archer civilization. First bonus. After advancing to the next stage, steal the first 50, 100, 200 resources your opponents gather. That means that whenever a villager drops, you would get those resources in your stockpile automatically. If a villager is carrying resources that would bring over this threshold, your opponent gets whatever is left over as per usual. Now, this is, of course, in reference to the Purépecha's tribute system that they would set up on people that they conquered. And in practice, my hope for this bonus is that it will give you a substantial incremental economic advantage. In total, you are getting a 700-point resource swing, though you don't have any control over what resources you get, and it kicks in a good deal later than you typically want free resource bonuses to come into effect. Second bonus, coinage and banking improve the training time of all of your military units by a small amount. This will make these technologies kind of desirable in 1v1 games. Now, why did I do this? Well, even though the Purépecha did not really mint coins of any kind, they did have, again, a very elaborate trade and tribute system. And one of the features of this system was that conquered peoples could, instead of paying tribute, pay in military service. And so I thought that adapting these tribute-focused technologies to benefit your military recruitment time would be a good way of representing that. Third bonus. Farmers and fishermen move 40% faster while working. Now, what does this mean? It means that when your villagers are returning to drop off their resources, they sprint. When your farmers are kind of meandering across their farm, they will power walk to get to their next location. It's not an incredibly impactful bonus, in my opinion. It's going to be best for shorefish when your mill is a little ways away. And for farms, they will, I'm guessing, provide 3 or 4% of incremental advantage. This bonus will come into effect when you click Send Villagers Back to Work at your town center after rebuffing a raid. Fourth bonus, unit upgrades and blacksmith technologies are researched 50% faster. Kind of similar to the Bulgarians' team bonus, but also applying to any elite upgrade or even installation technology that the Purépecha have available. Now, this is of course in reference to their amazing metalworking abilities and military armament production on the whole, and will generally allow the Purépecha to have a much easier time with tech switches, giving them a very flexible and versatile army that is able to rapidly adapt to what an opponent is throwing at them. Last bonus before we move on to unique stuff, their team bonus. Castles on your entire team reduce the work rate of enemy buildings within their line of sight by 25% in Castle Age, 33% Imperial Age. This is, of course, in reference to the Purépecha's fort networks, which they set up to impose regional hegemony. The goal of this is to promote a very aggressive forward playstyle from the Purépecha, starting in around the mid-game, where you're trying to castle drop your opponent such that they have a harder time rebuffing you because their buildings are working slower. This applies to all technologies as well, by the way, and even if your castle can't shoot a building, it's still probably within its line of sight if you have town patrol. Is it a strong bonus? I don't really think so, but it's one that I think will reward aggressive and creative playstyles, even if it does open up the possibility of getting a doubt castle on your hands. On to their uniques. Their unique unit is the Cuangarieja. This is a hybrid infantry and archer unit costing 25 of each of the 3 major resources. It is a jack of all trades. It is a pretty quick unit, a little bit tanky, it has a good rate of fire, but its attack in melee form is fairly low. It does, however, have an okay attack bonus versus cavalry, and, like the Roth, it is able to swap to a bow. Its bow attack, however, is fairly weak. It is a good deal worse than a plumed archer, and it loses its attack bonus versus cavalry. The goal with a Cuangarieja is to plug up holes within your army composition. If you're having trouble getting out halberdiers, they're okay against cavalry in a pinch. If your backline is starting to drop, they can fill that role too. The fact that they're quick and tanky, though I should note that they lose their pierce armor in archer mode, also makes them pretty good at raiding. So in summary, they are trying to reinforce the Purépecha's identity of having a flexible military, quickly adapting to whatever the enemy is throwing at them without having too much of an economic investment required. The Cuangarieja is, after all, relatively cheap, requiring a balanced economy, but pretty easy to spam out if you have even a slight surplus of resources. Quickly touching upon their unique technologies, the Castle Age one is called Washanoti. This is in reference to merchants that the Purépecha would enlist to go into hostile territories like that of the Aztecs to do trading and gather information for the Purépecha, since if they sent in one of their own, it's likely they would just be attacked for speaking Purépecha instead of the local language. The technology Washanoti would give trade units bonus line of sight, a dodge shield, and a taunt effect, briefly preventing attackers from being retasked once they aggroed onto the trade unit. Now, obviously, the line of sight thing and dodge shield are in reference to these units being used as spies and also being less likely to be just attacked on sight than normal Purépecha. But the taunt effect is me trying to combine some of those Purépecha stories about tricking incoming armies with surpluses of food and other ambushes and traps. Effectively, it's allowing you to use your trade units to bait enemy armies in while still surviving thanks to that dodge shield. Since trade units are so fast, you can grab aggro, drag a couple of enemies into your army, and have your army pounce upon them. Do I think it will work every time? No, definitely not. But it'll be sick when it works, and it will give your trade line a little bit of added resilience in team games. Second unique technology, the Imperial Age technology, Purépecha. This was a warrior initiation ritual, the details on which are not well known, but I am implementing it as giving all melee attacks the ability to briefly rend pierce armor. This means that anytime a melee unit of the Purépecha strikes an enemy, the enemy will lose 1 pierce armor. This fades after 10 seconds, but additional strikes will refresh this timer. This is the Purépecha's capstone technology, the thing that really brings their strategy together. They want a flexible army with a melee frontline and a ranged backline. The melee frontline shreds the enemy's pierce armor, the ranged backline picks them apart. It's the reason I classify them as an archer civilization. There are many stories about Purépecha copper weapons ripping right through other Mesoamerican people's armor, and this is kind of how I chose to implement this. With your melee spears, you smash the enemy shields, and then with no shield to protect them, they are helpless against your projectile fire. As always, if you want any further details on any of these specifics about the civilization, check out the civilization document down in the description, and let's move on to an overview of the Purépecha's tech tree. Spirit of the Law style with letter grades. Infantry to start. They are getting a B for their infantry. They do have their unique Quangarieja unit as well as the elite Eagle Warrior, and Purépecha means that you will always want to be using your infantrymen. However, they are missing a lot of power on their infantry. They don't have elite jags, two-handed swordsmen, so they're stuck with long swords, and squires, meaning that your infantry are going to have a much harder time getting to the front line in order to actually shred armor the way you want them to. You'll obviously default to your halberdiers very often, but remember, your eagles and Quangarieja are much better at getting to the enemy in order to shred the armor, so a nice mix of all of them will often be what you want to do. Again, they're a very flexible civilization, and they'll be able to get to these unit upgrades much faster than normal. For archers, they have an A-. They have the Quangarieja, which is again an archer unique unit. They have Purépecha, which rewards archers, and they have a perfect archery range for a Mesoamerican civilization. Honestly, they're pretty much candidates for an A, and since they are classified as an archer civilization, I was hesitant to give them an A-, but their archers don't have power. You know what I mean? Like, they need infantry in order to get maximum damage output from Purépecha. So I think a better grade would be like a borderline A-. I would put them lower than a committed archer civilization like the Britons, but they're definitely much, much better than average. On to siege. It's a B. They have siege engineers, but they miss siege ram and siege onager. Pretty much as average as you can get. For defenses, it's a B-. They don't have keep, and they miss a couple of key university technologies, but they do have that castle bonus, though that is more an offensive tactic than a defensive one. Like, if you're building castles defensively as the Purépecha, you're not going to be taking advantage of their team bonus for the most part. Onto their economy. It is an A. They have Washanoti, woo, your trade units are sneaky, but more importantly than that, they have perfect economy technologies, they have their steel bonus, and they have their incremental farming and fishing bonus. So it's a very rounded economy that, more importantly, will be draining the opponent's economy in the process. Onto their levies. This is my term for trash units. They're getting an A-. Like other Mesoamerican civilizations, they have the elite slinger. They have Purépecha, which in trash wars will be great, because halberdiers plus skirmishers, that's perfect situation for Purépecha to put in work. And while they miss squires, they do have access to that strong coinage and banking bonus to give them that little bit of extra train time. They also have their smith and upgrade bonus, which will make it so that you can tech into the trash units you need faster. So overall, while it's not quite perfect, especially due to missing squires, I think that post-imperial situations will see them with a very strong trash army at their disposal. Onto their dock. It's a B+, well above average among Mesoamerican civilizations. They don't have cannon galleon or heavy demo, but otherwise they have a perfect dock tech tree. And their various eco advantages, faster military train time, and upgrade and smith bonuses will all help out their water as well. So overall, you could do much worse than the Purépecha on water maps. And for monks, it's a B-. They don't have atonement, don't have faith, but otherwise completely unremarkable. Yay, you'll use monks for monk stuff, and you won't when you don't need monks. What a crappy unit. Seriously, the monastery needs so much love. For a future video, my friends. For a future video. Let's move on to the playstyle that I see the Purépecha having if they were to be implemented in the game as we know it now. In the early game, you're going to have a relatively average Dark Age, but once Feudal kicks in, things will start looking nice. You get those quick upgrades, which will be most important for rush timings, as well as stolen resources. Now, 50 is not a lot, but considering you're also stealing 50 from your opponent, I see the Purépecha potentially having some very, very nice rush timings that they can make use of in early feudal. The mid-game will, in my opinion, see a continuation of these feudal strengths without too many major changes. They have a very adaptable military. You can go crossbows, eagle warriors, jaguars, atlatls, or go into your cuangarieja, and you'll steal even more resources every time you age up, hopefully allowing you to push your lead even further as the game progresses. They also can even make use of their market in 1v1 better than average. Not only can they trade resources like everyone else, but Washanoti will give their trade carts some incremental use now and again if you want to get cute, and coinage and banking will genuinely make a difference in late game scenarios when you're trying to chug out units as fast as you possibly can. Lastly, they do have some funky forward castle stuff that they can do, and since their cuangarieja are so versatile, it will be quite easy to defend your castle. Enemy sending rams? Put them into melee mode. Enemy trying to flank around you with knights? Put them in ranged mode. I see this as being one of the best castle drop civilizations, especially on a map like Arena where castle dropping is already a pretty strong strategy. Lastly, moving into the late game, you have a very strong death ball at your disposal. Obviously, you're going to want to have your infantry frontline, which is then backed up by your ranged units, and with Purépecha putting it all together and your cuangarieja allowing you to kind of fill roles that are lacking at any given time, you should be able to chug through enemy forces. Pretty much the only thing you'll be consistently bad against is siege onagers and similar. So think of them as kind of an Incan-esque late game where you're focusing on combined arms to power through your opponent's forces. They are, as mentioned, quite good in post-Imperial Age trash wars for this very same reason. And while their economy is still good, like it's fine, it's not amazing. Because obviously you no longer can steal resources upon aging up. You're already in Imperial Age. And your farmer-fisherman bonus I don't see as being nearly as helpful this late in the game. So in summary, once you hit late game, the focus is less on your eco advantages and your timings, and more on raw power and mustering as many soldiers as you can into a big, beautiful death ball that can just steamroll right through your opponent's base. Lastly, let's touch upon some loose threads before I finish this video, starting with some uncertainties, some questions that weren't quite satisfactorily answered as I was going through this build. The first one being, for an economy and archer civilization, I don't feel like I represented their archers quite well enough. In addition, I feel like their farmer and fisherman bonus is a little too weak. I really like the idea. I think that it fits their history quite well, especially the movements. Why movement speed over gather rate or something like that? Well, it's because the Purépecha were known for fleeing to secret villages in the hills during times of great strife, especially during the Spanish invasion. And so because of that, I wanted some way to let their villagers be quicker while still contributing to their economy and not just giving them the Berber bonus, because I thought that would be a little bit lazy. And so in summary, while I think all the bonuses I gave them are very historical, it might not fit their intended playstyle as much as I had been hoping. And secondly, they have a very boring tech tree. Like, they're good at a lot of stuff, and they don't have a lot of gaping weaknesses. And while I know a lot of you might like that, I like designing civilizations that have substantial weaknesses and substantial strengths, and this one just feels a little milquetoast for my liking. What do you guys think? On to some tabled ideas. These are cool thoughts I had that didn't make the build, and let me tell you, I have more tabled ideas for this civilization than for any I have ever done, so I'm going to go through them quickly. Let's lightning round. Starting, villas move faster when tasked to garrison. This was another way of doing the farmer-fisherman reference that I was alluding to just now, but I thought it was too defensive and I wanted to keep them economy-focused. Another one, stealing the Aztec carry bonus. The Purépecha are very deserving of something like that, but I don't know whether people want me to be stealing bonuses from other civilizations, so I will say next week's build will do so. On. First mining camp and smith, free and built instantly. I think it's a very cool idea. I think it's very fitting. I think the unit upgrade and smith technology being faster is possibly a better way of referencing this, but the Purépecha did have the best mining networks in all of Mesoamerica, so I would be happy to swap this bonus in for the current unit upgrade and smith tech bonus if people thought it was just more fitting. I had a number of kind of smith/mining bonuses in mind, much like what I was trying to do for the Moravians build, and another one was whenever you research an economy technology or a blacksmith technology, it returns like a quarter of the resources back to you in whatever wasn't used. So if you get fletching, that's like 150 resources, gold and food. It'll get you back whatever 150 divided by 4 is like 37.5 or something like that in wood. It's cool, it's versatile, it gives them this adaptable economy, and it really pushes them as an economy civilization while still referencing how good their smith was. This is another one I could be very easily convinced to implement into the civilization if it was looking underpowered. Along the same lines of what I was trying to go for with Washanoti, this one would be trade carts can trade with enemy drop camps. Not stealing the resource from the enemy, but just giving you an ability to grab some food from an enemy mill and drop it at your market to get some food. Is it cool? Absolutely. Do I think it would ever come up in game? It could, but I think it would be very swingy and very unlikely to work most of the time. So better to stick with Washanoti, which I already think is a very weird technology. Another one, if you tribute resources to an enemy, you steal back that much from them over a period, including a dividend. Obviously, this is in reference to the whole tribute and taxing situation they set up. I really want to do a build that allows you to effectively do something with tributing in 1v1. That would be so cool. I didn't think this was the place to do it because there was a lot of other business going on already, and I like the stealing on age up mechanic a little more than this one. Another one, enemy line of sight is reduced per age for units besides scouts. Not by a lot, but by enough it will be very annoying and require range units to have a spotter in many situations. Now, why did I do this? Well, this one doesn't have fantastic grounding, but for the most part, it was because it was notoriously difficult to find Purépecha when they did not want to be found, because they'd run off to those secret mountain villages I was just talking about. And as mentioned, they were masters of ambushes. So I felt like this was a good way to make it feel like your enemy was always walking into an ambush of some kind. I think it's very cool, but it's very, very disruptive, and I think it might be a better fit on another civilization. Another option, cheaper archery range technologies overall to kind of mirror the Burgundian and Dravidian bonus. This was another one I was very close to going with, but it's not brilliantly historically grounded, so we can save this one for another archer civilization down the line. Another one, you start with an invulnerable passable terrace, like a bit of elevation that has a unique top to it. This would be called a Pitatsekwa. This was an artifact left by a civilization prior to the Purépecha that they often used in construction of their settlements and cities. Might have been the Olmecs? I don't think it was the Olmecs. Toltecs? I can't remember. My Mesoamerican history is not good enough yet to be able to quote them off the top of my head. And my idea for this terrace is that besides just being free elevation in your base, if you build on it, that building is cheaper and quicker to create, meaning that you always have like a guaranteed fast building spot really close to your starting town center. It's a very cool idea. If I didn't know what else to do with the civilization, I absolutely would have gone with this. But as you can see, I had a lot of ideas here and I needed to prioritize them. Those are all the ideas I had for bonuses. Now be ready for a mountain of unique units and technologies. The Tsinsun, I had this one going for a while. A hummingbird warrior. Is it brilliantly grounded? No. But hummingbirds were a major focus of Purépecha religion, and in fact, the great Huitzilopochtli, as the Aztecs knew him, the Mesoamerican war god, was very important to the Purépecha. And what was his symbol? The hummingbird. And as such, this hummingbird warrior would be like a fast spearman who shreds pierce armor and does bonus damage proportionate to enemies' pierce armor, making him like an anti-archer infantryman. I had this one as my unique unit right up until I learned about the Cuangarieja, who just felt more grounded. Still a really cool idea. I was very tempted to use this one. Another unique unit, the Ocambeja. This was like a tax collector who went around to vassalize people and said, all right, if you're not going to pay us money, then you have to come to war. And the idea with this is he would convert an enemy building, but instead of stealing the building, you would get a bunch of free units out of that building, representing them levying local soldiers in times of war. Very cool idea, but once again, I had a lot of cool ideas for this civilization and didn't want to take it too off the rail. Another one, a unique building called the Yakata. This is those tombs I was referring to a ways earlier in the flavor section. My idea for this was maybe they could be like a population-given building because they were an actual dwelling, but they would also like count nearby dead allies and give you a bonus. I just never manifested what that bonus would be, hence why I didn't go with the Yakata. But if I could think of one, this would be a shoe-in for the civilization. The Yakata were iconic to the Purépecha as a people. And we need more unique buildings. The Trojes, this is another unique building. It was this big house that the Purépecha were famous for with the plentiful timber of their region. I thought it could replace the house and be like a 4x4 house that's cheaper than 4 houses put together and gives you more population than 4 houses put together and can be passed through by allies but not enemies. Just like big fat house. Cool idea, not really synergistic with the rest of the civilization, however. Another one, a unique technology, chakmuls. These were like sacrificial offering jars outside of different temple complexes, and this would let villagers drop resources at monasteries for additional slow dividends over time. Cool bonus, quite like it. Other ones were better, and I felt like I was pushing them a little too hard on the eco front already. Another unique technology, my voice is getting tired, Angameha. This would allow houses, camps, and farms to be both passable and stackable to a degree. Like, you couldn't go too crazy, but you could, for example, have two farms partially overlap. Angameha were like regional administrators, initially appointed by Tsitsipan de Quare and eventually becoming a mainstay of Purépecha bureaucracy, and they effectively said who could do what with what land. I love the passable and stackable idea. I was playing with a couple of passable ideas, but once again, it felt like something a bit too specific to stick into a civilization that I already had so many other good ideas for. Passable and stackable mechanics I definitely want to play with for future civilizations, however. And lastly, a regional unit, the Ashamenka. This is a Purépecha word meaning sacrificer. They'd be like a religious warrior built at the monastery who has an attack bonus versus weak enemies, and if they land the finishing blow, they will heal nearby allies. I know a lot of people have wanted to see more proper sacrificing mechanics on Mesoamerican peoples for a while, and I think this would be an actually great way to do it that was actually grounded. Like, it was actually a guy called a sacrificer, distinct from the monks and priests. But I already have 3 regional units. I don't want to crowd you guys too much. Just know that this guy, I really want to revisit this guy at some point in the future. Oh no, there's another one. The ball game court, of course. You guys know the Mesoamerican ball game. It's so cool. It's like iconic to them as a region. I just didn't know what its effect would be. It would be such a great regional building, and it was so important for culture, but culture isn't really something that's easy to represent in Age of Empires 2. Consider this one like the Yakata. I really like it and I really want to implement it, but I don't know what to do with it yet, so I'm going to come back to it later once I figure it out. And with that, we finally come to the end. Whoa, that was a lot of tabled ideas. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one. The Purépecha are one of the most requested civilizations on this channel, and I thank everyone who pointed me towards them, especially commenter David GG, who was, I believe, the first person to ever request this civilization, as referenced on the poll that you can see on screen right now. Forgot to put it in the presentation earlier. My bad. Sorry, David. Before we go, let's take a look at the good old likeLyometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the Purépecha could be implemented into the game as we know it right now, possibly even looking a little bit like the build I have here. And on the likeLyometer for the Purépecha, we have an 8 out of 10. I think it is quite likely the Purépecha are added. I am sure the devs know how much people want to see more Mesoamerican civilizations in the game. I'm sure they know. And if they do, the Purépecha, in my opinion, are probably the single best option to add. As you saw in my tabled ideas section, there are tons of ways you could take the civilization, even if I think economy and archers are the most fitting and grounded. But I want to hear now what you think. How did you like this build of the Purépecha? Is there anything that you would have done differently? Any elements of the history you didn't think I captured properly? And any remixing of the many tabled ideas I have that could be better fits than the bonuses that I have on my current build? And lastly, I want to hear what other sorts of content you want to see from me on this channel, other civilizations you want me to tackle, other units you want to see me take a crack at, anything else besides. But until then, my name is Robbie Howell. And ciao for now.